Harper Audio presents The Boys of Pointe Du Hoc, Ronald Reagan, D-Day, and the U.S. Army 2nd Ranger Battalion. Written and read by Douglas Brinkley. Introduction. Setting the stage. One brisk morning at the White House in early October 1981, as President Ronald Reagan was preparing for a state visit from French President François Mitterrand, his Deputy Chief of Staff, Michael Deaver, informed him that the French government was eager to present him a prestigious decoration when the two leaders met in historic Yorktown, Virginia. A quizzical Reagan was baffled. What decoration? An unsure Deaver answered, "I think it's the Croix de Guerre." Clearly displeased by the rejoinder, Reagan, his face flushing, balked. His lips, in fact, contorted into a half-pout. What was this nonsense? He had not earned epaulets. There was no Purple Heart or Bronze Star in his attic trunk that could be dusted off and flaunted for his grandkids. He was no colossal World War II hero. His tame warriors were spent stateside in San Francisco and Culver City, feigning to be a bomber pilot, directing and starring in over 300 training films for the Army Air Corps. "But that's for bravery," Reagan impatiently snapped. "All I ever did was fly a desk. We better get this straightened out right away. I couldn't possibly accept the Croix de Guerre." Evan Galbraith, realizing that Reagan was aghast at the implication that he was qualified for such a distinguished military award, quickly looked into the matter. Getting on the telephone, Galbraith, soon to become the Reagan administration's second ambassador to France, discovered there was indeed a bit of a mix-up. "It's not the Croix de Guerre they'll be giving you after all," a relieved Galbraith blurted out. "It's the Legion of Honor." A still puzzled Reagan asked for what possible reason. "Statesmanship," Galbraith answered. Suddenly Reagan's whole demeanor changed. A relaxed, confident smile now beamed forth. The look of consternation had dissipated from his furrowed brow. His usual radiant, genial mood was back in full force. Comically, he pretended to be fixing his tie knot. "I can play that role," he laughed. Indeed he could. This story took place on the eve of celebrating the 200th anniversary of France's coming to the aid of George Washington's Continental Army at the Battle of Yorktown. President Reagan reciprocated in June 1982 when he visited France as part of his first European trip since becoming president. Along with his devoted wife Nancy, the First Lady, he lodged at both the ornate Grand Trianon Retreat at Versailles, still awe-inspiring after 3 centuries, and at the Paris residence of Ambassador Galbraith. Keeping a hectic schedule, Reagan held substantive meetings with President Mitterrand, Paris Mayor Jacques Chirac, Japanese Prime Minister Zenko Suzuki, and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at a 3-day World Economic Summit at the Palace of Versailles. Whenever import-export issues were raised or Middle East politics thrashed out, Reagan invariably steered the conversation back to Cold War geopolitics. "We are moving forward to restore America's defensive strength after a decade of neglect," Reagan exhorted at dinner on June 3rd. "A strong America and a vital, unified alliance are indispensable to keeping the peace now and in the future, just as they have been in the past." With his peace-through-strength foreign policy approach, Reagan was trying to create the indelible image of the tough protean Cold War statesman, a trifecta combination of FDR, optimist communicator, Truman, straightforward honest, and Eisenhower, amiable shrewd. Throughout his European travels, he constantly invoked the need to re-energize the grand anti-fascist alliance of 1941 to 1945, which led to victory in World War II. Only this time around, Reagan believed, the global democratic crusade had a new enemy, the Soviet Union, a.k.a. the Evil Empire. On June 5th, Reagan gave a well-rehearsed radio address from the Palace of Versailles, in which the time-honored memory of D-Day, particularly the vigilant leadership of Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, was given a fulsome embrace. France may have helped the United States win at Yorktown, but, Reagan insisted, America repaid the favor in spades 163 years later at Normandy. One lesson of D-Day is as clear now as it was 38 years ago, Reagan stated in his radio broadcast, which aired that day in the United States. Only strength can deter tyranny and aggression. In tape remarks for French television, Reagan echoed the same sentiment. D-Day was a success, he said, and the Allies had breached Hitler's seawall. They swept into Europe, liberating towns and cities and countrysides until the Axis powers were finally crushed. We remember D-Day because the French, British, Canadian, and Americans fought shoulder to shoulder for democracy and freedom, and won. The term D-Day was not coined for the Allied invasion. The same moniker was given to the attack date of nearly every offensive during World War II. It was first coined during World War I, before the massive U.S. attack at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in France on September 12, 1918. The D was shorthand for day. The expression literally meant day and signified the day of an attack. By the end of World War II, however, the expression was synonymous with only one date, June 6, 1944. Evoking the fact that over 150,000 Allied troops had stormed the Normandy coast 38 years before at the cost of more than 10,500 dead, wounded, or missing men, Reagan pledged that America would do it again if it meant freeing France from a totalitarian aggressor like the Soviet Union. In the second year of his presidency, the resurrection of D-Day, the greatest amphibious landing in world history, as a defining moment in recent American history, was already a central part of his anti-Soviet Cold War policy. He closed his radio remarks by reading President Franklin D. Roosevelt's inspired D-Day prayer to the nation. According to historian John Meacham, author of Franklin and Winston, when FDR had read the prayer on the radio, he was playing the part of national pastor. Now Reagan, in a far less dramatic historical moment, was doing the same. 2 years later, on June 6, 1984, Reagan came back to France for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. The emotive speech he delivered at the windswept Normandy promontory, looking out over the English Channel, known now in history as the Boys of Pointe Du Hoc address, was the opening salvo to a new American indebtedness to World War II veterans. By honoring the daring action of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, 225 young Army volunteers whose mission was to climb the treacherous 100-foot-high Pointe Du Hoc cliff while being shot at by entrenched German soldiers, he was paying tribute to an entire generation. Out of those 225 boys, only 99 survived the amphibious assault. Later that afternoon, the president also gave a stirring oration at Omaha Beach, not far from where the plaque on a bronze memorial statue honors the spirit of American youth rising from the waves. By the 1980s, these youths were aging gray hairs, the new old. Pointe Du Hoc and Omaha Beach were Reagan's signature moments, Ken Duberstein, a former White House chief of staff, recalled. If I have one enduring memory of Reagan, it's the way he crisply saluted World War II veterans that afternoon. These were his guys. Then there was the moving visual of Reagan walking with Nancy amongst all the grave sites, which looked like miles and miles of white crosses. That was an unforgettable moment of absolute reverence for the World War II vets. As president, Ronald Reagan delivered 3 unforgettable speeches: Pointe Du Hoc, the Challenger disaster, and the Berlin Tear Down This Wall number. But, Duberstein concludes, it was the first of these, Pointe Du Hoc, that set the tone for the others. Before Reagan dubbed the 2nd Ranger Battalion the Boys of Pointe Du Hoc, they were known as Rudder's Rangers, named after their feisty, tough-minded commanding officer, Colonel James Earl Rudder. Historian Ronald L. Lane's Rudder's Rangers, first published in 1979, remains the indispensable book on the World War II years of this remarkable fighting man. Another invaluable book on the battalion is Robert W. Black's Riveting Rangers in World War II, a definitive popular study of these elite fighting men. From an archival perspective, the Eisenhower Center for American Studies at the University of New Orleans, of which I served as director from 1994 to 2004, has numerous transcribed oral histories of various U.S. Army 2nd Battalion survivors. Never before have these oral histories been so fully tapped as in the writing of this book. What distinguishes this deliberation from other D-Day narratives is the interweaving of the Battle of Pointe Du Hoc, June 6, 1944, with the ascendance of President Ronald Reagan's new patriotism, June 6, 1984. With the assistance of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, I've been able to document how and why our 40th president played a seminal role in launching the great reappreciation of World War II veterans that swept over America in the 1980s and continues today largely unabated. If it hadn't been for Reagan's two elegiac June 6, 1984 homilies, written by Peggy Noonan, Pointe Du Hoc, and Anthony Dolan, Omaha Beach, there may never have been Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation, Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, or numerous memorials like the National D-Day Museum in New Orleans, built to exalt the citizen soldiers who liberated Europe. As biographer Lou Cannon wrote, Reagan's performance in Normandy demonstrated the timing, dramatic sense, and attention to detail for which the White House staff was famous during his presidency. It was reporter Michael Dobbs of The Post who best put his finger on the 1980s-style new patriotism, which was unleashed across America to commemorate D-Day plus 40 years. 40 years after D-Day, Normandy is bracing itself for a new invasion of a foreign army of 30,000 war veterans, journalists, television crews, tourists, and Secret Service agents, with 5 monarchs, 2 presidents, and a platoon of prime ministers in the vanguard, Dobbs forecasted on June 1, 1984. He went on, "For the politicians, notably President Reagan, the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings can be seen as a valuable public relations exercise at a time when election campaigns are in progress on both sides of the Atlantic. For the press and television, it represents one of the most colorful international news events since Britain's royal wedding 3 years ago. For veterans, most of them now well over 60, the ceremonies could turn out to be the last opportunity for recapturing memories about the most momentous day in their lives. According to officials at the U.S. cemetery in France, a surprising number are taking advantage of retirement to return for the first time with their wives and families." And return they did that June. Anywhere from 10,000 to 15,000 U.S. D-Day veterans made the transatlantic odyssey. Their reasons for doing so were legion. Nearly all, however, wanted to pay obeisance to the past, to those armed forces members who had perished for freedom during the Second World War. The pre-anniversary D-Day hype orchestrated by the Reagan administration allowed many of these veterans, for the first time, to finally debrief their unknowing wives and children and grandchildren about the grotesque horrors they had witnessed. No more buried remembrances. With Reagan as president, the time had come for the World War II generation to speak out, even if it was a psychologically gut-wrenching proposition. By 1984, the stars were aligned for thousands of these stoic war heroes to finally offer eyewitness testimonials for posterity's sake. It was, in essence, a generational reckoning. Although these veterans had been allergic to boasting, President Reagan and the national media convinced them that telling what happened was their final duty to their country. Just as Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had ordered the U.S. Army to film the concentration camps immediately after their liberation by Allied forces so the Nazis would forever be held responsible for their sadistic war crimes, so too did these World War II veterans, 40 years after D-Day, come forward with painful remembrances. It was as if they were finally ready, like the time-worn characters in Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River anthology, to walk on a center stage for a few moments, take a self-deprecating half-bow, and recount their personal story of wartime survival to younger generations. Sensing the zeitgeist, and in large part for political purposes, President Reagan became the Greatest Generation's self-appointed spokesperson on June 6, 1984. Although he never fought in World War II, Reagan, as mentioned, had served in the Army Air Corps, eventually becoming a captain. All of the propaganda movies he made then were, in essence, a dress rehearsal for June 6, 1984. His dramatic words that day triggered the so-called Greatest Generation phenomenon, which swept across the United States largely unabated until the tragedy of September 11, 2001, brought a new group of heroes, particularly rescue workers, dedicated firemen, and city policemen, to the national forefront. In the early 1980s, with the impeccable timing of a maestro, Reagan galvanized the World War II generation into performing one last task: reminding a nation cynical after Vietnam and Watergate that America truly was still the shining city on the hill. What Reagan understood was that compared with the testimony of an Army Ranger who, climbing the Pointe Du Hoc cliffs, had been forced to watch a buddy drown in the turbulent English Channel, or a young officer get his legs blown off by a Nazi mine, 1970s slogans like acid, amnesty, and abortion were political throwaway lines of a decadent and largely self-indulgent recent past. What President Reagan was trying to engineer in 1984, using the World War II generation and the American flag as his platform, was the creation of a combustible patriotism, one that would spread like wildfire, an extension of his 1980 presidential campaign's embrace of increased military spending and upgrading the armed forces. He essentially wanted to turn the clock back to an unambiguous black and white era when, as Stephen Ambrose opined in Citizen Soldiers, the sight of a GI meant joyous cheers from those communities occupied by fascist troops. As Ambrose wrote, the we generation of World War II, as in we are all in this together, was a special breed of men and women who did great things for America and the world. When the GIs sailed for Europe, they were coming to the continent not as conquerors, but liberators. From Reagan's perspective, too many young people knew about the horrendous atrocities at My Lai and not enough about the raw gallantry of D-Day. Although he delivered numerous triumphalist paeans during his 1980 presidential campaign and was constantly challenging the Soviet Union to free its own people from communist tyranny, it was his vivid June 6, 1984, Boys of Pointe Du Hoc speech, carried live on major U.S. television networks, that raised the bar on an entire generation poised at the cusp of collecting Social Security checks. Even Reagan's sharpest liberal critics, like ABC's White House correspondent Sam Donaldson, had to admit that the president had delivered that Normandy speech with an unmistakable inner conviction, one that started the transformation of his historical image from conservative president to America's president. Journalist Michael Barone of U.S. News and World Report, in his fine book Our Country, The Shaping of America from Roosevelt to Reagan, believed that based on the potency of Reagan's Pointe Du Hoc devotional, the election was over by June 6th. Up until that speech, the World War II event most Americans honored was Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th. After that, August 6th, the day the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima, was probably the best remembered anniversary moment of the war. The problem, from Reagan's optimistic point of view, was that we lost the Battle of Pearl Harbor. How do you create a new patriotism over American unpreparedness and battleships on fire? President Franklin D. Roosevelt was effectively able to use Pearl Harbor as a rallying cry back in December 1941, a clarion call that bespoke determined revenge. But there were ambiguities surrounding Pearl Harbor, an event anti-FDR isolationists deemed the Great Deception. Blue ribbon investigative commissions, 9 of them to be exact, were created, for example, to discuss what went wrong in Hawaii and which officer was responsible for the shocking debacle. As for Hiroshima, many people around the world, and peace activists at home, thought it stood for unconscionable genocide. While most Americans surveyed since 1945 believed that President Harry S. Truman was more than justified in dropping an atomic bomb on the city of 350,000 people, for the simple reason that it eliminated the need for an invasion of the Japanese homelands, it wasn't a military event that conjured up unrestrained, full-bore patriotic pride. When discussing Hiroshima, people often turned defensive, saying things like, "We had to drop it," or "What choice did Truman have?" The wholesale destruction of a city, where civilians were killed in unacceptably high numbers, was hardly the best symbolic event on which to build a new patriotism movement. But D-Day? The liberation of Europe? The boys of Pointe Du Hoc? That was a different, perfect cause story to sell. There were no unanswered questions or moral ambiguities about the Normandy invasion. Our young martyrs liberated Europe from the macabre stranglehold of the diabolical Hitler. Period. American GIs gave their lives so others could live free. D-Day was clearly America's finest hour, and Reagan knew it. The real question about D-Day was how to boil it down to a condensed Reader's Digest-like feature, where American soldiers, not the celebrated Armada itself, were the emblematic heroes. Most Americans, for example, know very little about George Washington's Revolutionary War battles at Brandywine or Long Island, but we all know he froze, along with his men at Valley Forge. Why? Because that ordeal exudes inherent human drama. Men suffering from frostbite, dysentery, pestilence, and scurvy, because they believed in democracy and liberty. By the time of his June 6, 1984 speech, the cliffs at Pointe Du Hoc had become to Reagan an enduring, symbolic American locale just like Valley Forge, even though it was situated on French soil. NBC News anchor Tom Brokaw, who had been in Normandy filming a documentary, had not yet coined the phrase the greatest generation when Reagan delivered his 40th anniversary orations. That would come a decade later, in 1994. But Reagan, as a charter member of that generation, had intuitively believed for over 4 decades that the Americans who died at Normandy and other such sacred battlefields truly were cut from a special cloth. Along with the savage deprivations of the Great Depression, the Second World War had been the definitive event of Reagan's generation. Those who had survived the global cataclysm, like himself, still share the old-fashioned sense of duty, honor, and country that the war instilled. Ever since Pearl Harbor, and long after VJ Day, the veterans of World War II, who included Reagan in their ranks, never wavered from their determined motto, "We're all in this together." Anybody who was ever close to Reagan tells stories, his stories, about how much he admired the American fortitude displayed during World War II at such faraway places as Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Sicily, Anzio, and of course, Normandy. As Brokaw recalled in 2004, Reagan was a master storyteller. When you go back over his 8-year presidency, like we did when he died, it's the way he brought real people into his speeches that stands out. I believe that Reagan's The Boys of Pointe Du Hoc speech, which Peggy Noonan wrote, was the beginning of the rekindled awareness of what we owe the World War II generation. He opened the window, so to speak, so we could all see through it. Generally speaking, Omaha Beach is too complicated for people to fully grasp. There was so much going on. But as Reagan recognized, you could get your hands around Pointe Du Hoc. The standoff there was about individual valor, Rangers climbing a cliff under fire, yet they kept on going. Nobody made much of a fuss over D-Day before Reagan. It was the perfect military moment for him to honor, and he seized upon it. Chapter 1. Darby's Rangers. As a movie actor, history buff, and unabashed nationalist, President Ronald Reagan, while he prepared for the 40th anniversary of D-Day, was keenly aware of the sheer power the word Ranger conjured in the American imagination, even if his facts about their early combat antics were, as historian Gary Wills claims, often of the Disneyland triumphalist variety. Ever since Jamestown was established by English settlers in 1607, Ranger had become part of the New World vocabulary. Feeling vulnerable to attack by Native Americans, early colonists dispatched armed scouts to roam the wilderness and, if necessary, exterminate potential enemies before any Indians could wreak havoc on their Christian communities. The daily reports of these scouts often said something like, "Range 20 miles yesterday," or "too rainy to range far," so it didn't take long for the term Ranger to stick. They were, in effect, wilderness patrolmen. They realized early on that European-style warfare was unsuitable to America's royal terrain. Rangers, adjusting to topography, adopted the stealth tactics and nomadic ways of the various Indian tribes who freely roamed the eastern seaboard, and they aroused the hostility of the Native Americans inhabiting it. Such combat was almost the antithesis of European warfare, which at the time consisted of much maneuvering and very little fighting. In the last decades of the 17th century, Rangers, acting as quasi-military units, first appeared in Massachusetts and Virginia. At that time, combat in North America was influenced by the wilderness. As soon as the French and Indian War of 1756 to 1763 broke out, a natty bumpo-like New Hampshire backwoodsman named Robert Rogers, livid that Native American warriors constantly ambushed local forts and homesteads in hit-and-run raids, sought revenge. He signed up with the British Army to be a scout. Before long, he received a commission as captain and organized a ranger team of a few dozen men trained for hand-to-hand combat against both the French and Indians. Officially, they were the Ranger Company of the New Hampshire Provincial Regiment. A year later, they had become His Majesty's Independent Company of American Rangers. Clad in distinctive green outfits, they eventually became known as Rogers Rangers and soon attacked French fortifications along Lake Champlain and Lake George. Accordingly, Rogers was dubbed Wabi Madaando, or White Devil, by the Indians who crossed his path. He, in turn, in his 1765 book, A Concise Account of North America, said that Native Americans had revengeful dispositions. Historian J.D. Locke wrote further about this. Throughout the French and Indian War, Rogers and his Rangers continued to wage unconventional warfare throughout the upper New York, lower Canadian, and even French West Indies regions. Following the war, there were periodical revivals of Rogers Rangers in support of British operations until 1763, when they were paid off for the first time. The very notion of these Rangers, often with smeared war paint on their faces and waving sharp knives, caused unmitigated fear among the various Native American tribes warring against the British Empire. Teaching his mobile recruits how to live off the land, Rogers often took advantage of sub-zero winter weather to catch his slumbering enemies off guard. By using specially made snowshoes, Rogers Rangers could cross frozen rivers and lakes with bold ease, startling their unexpecting adversaries. Unusual for military men of the colonial era, these hardened Rangers sought to unnerve their opponents by engaging in everything from blood-curdling yells to midnight attacks. Lightning-fast raids were their specialty. Decimating the enemy was all that mattered. Almost intuitively, Rogers Rangers understood what, according to historian Robert W. Black, would become the modern-day mantra for the U.S. Army Rangers. It is all in the heart and the mind. During the American Revolution, Rogers volunteered to serve George Washington. The general refused his help, fearful he was a loyalist spy. Snubbed, Rogers abandoned the call for independence and instead organized a battalion of pro-British loyalist commandos known as the Queen's Rangers. If Washington didn't trust him, he would remain loyal to King George III. Back in Virginia, however, a new volunteer outfit, clad in coonskin caps and equipped with long rifles and hunting knives, took the fight to the Redcoats. Led by Captain Daniel Morgan, this Ranger Battalion did whatever chore was needed, from toggling across the swift currents of New York rivers to doing surveillance scouting in the pristine Virginia countryside. A great motivator of men, Morgan used a recruitment test that became legendary among Washington's Continental Army. He printed up numerous broadside illustrations of King George's robust head. To join his Rangers, you had to be able to shoot the British monarch in the face from 100 yards away, usually on the first try. Because of this hateful recruitment practice, Morgan was deemed a war criminal in London. But it was the lore surrounding the Texas Rangers that President Reagan was most familiar with. In 1823, Texas was still controlled by Mexico. Enter Stephen F. Austin, the so-called Father of Texas, who William Clark, of the Lewis and Clark expedition, anointed with special trust and confidence to become a new type of American frontier hero. With calm fortitude, Austin organized Ranger units whose sole mission was to free Texas. With Colt six-shooters on their hips and Kentucky rifles flung over their backs, they defended towns like San Antonio, Laredo, and Brownsville. Before long, their notorious reputation for gung-ho fearlessness had grown into the stuff of legend. Texas Rangers emerged as role models for a new type of indomitable American fighting man. During the Mexican-American War of 1846-48, the Texas Rangers once again did their part, helping Brigadier General Zachary Taylor control the Rio Grande. Meanwhile, in the northern states, West Point was still considered the proper place to prepare a young man for the vicissitudes of combat, not the wild cactus country along the Brazos River, which ran 840 miles across Texas to its mouth on the Gulf of Mexico. But throughout the more agrarian South, the idea of a Texas Ranger perched high atop a sleek stallion, his finger always poised on his trigger, spouting out words like freedom, independence, and liberty, had become part of the enduring folklore of the region. Studying Aristotle or Thucydides along the Hudson River seemed a feat compared with killing Apaches or Mexicans along the lawless border. Captain Jack Hayes, a colonel in the 1st Regiment, Texas Mounted Volunteers, became known for a prayer he delivered before the battles of Monterey and Mexico City. The prayer went, "O Lord, we are about to join battle with vastly superior numbers of enemy, and, Heavenly Father, we would like you to be on our side and help us. But if you can't do it, for Christ's sake, don't go over to them. But lay low, keep dark, and you'll see the damnedest fight you ever saw in all your born days." 150 years later, Hollywood actors like Chuck Norris played rough and ready, Hayes-like Texas Rangers on television. Macho action stars, white hats, fighting evil wherever it reared its ugly head. Given the Texas Rangers lore, it's not too surprising that when the cannons went off at Fort Sumner, South Carolina, and the Civil War commenced, the Confederate Army started organizing Ranger-style units. Between 1861 and 1865, in fact, about 400 Ranger outfits were created. By far the most infamous was Mosby's Rangers. Commanded by John S. Mosby of Virginia, who was nicknamed the Gray Ghost throughout Appalachia, the unit brought the fight to the Union Army like true guerrilla warriors. They blew up train depots, intercepted Yankee couriers, burned crops, sabotaged Union base camps, and did it all with a haunting rebel yell. By 1865, Mosby had risen to colonel, cited for meritorious service by Robert E. Lee, more so, in fact, than any other Confederate officer. As Major General Jeb Stuart said of Mosby in February 1864, his exploits are not surpassed in daring and enterprise by those of petite guerre. Unswerving devotion to duty, self-abnegation, and unflinching courage, with a quick perception and appreciation of the opportunity, are the characteristics of this officer. Given such an inspiring history, it is somewhat surprising to realize that the U.S. Army did not organize Ranger units until 1942. Part of the reason one suspects is that they had become synonymous with the Confederacy. The impetus of the Rangers' rebirth was the so-called commandos, whom British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was employing in 1940 in hopes of hindering the Nazi blitzkrieg across Europe. After the British were forced to flee from Dunkirk across the moat-like English Channel, a sense of desperation struck Downing Street. Could the United Kingdom survive the German onslaught if it only took a defensive posture? Shouldn't Britain find new ways to take the fight to the enemy? Wasn't an elite fighting force necessary? Churchill instructed the Ministry of Defense to increase the importance of British commandos, who could conduct secret amphibious operations, destroy Nazi targets, collect intelligence, and then covertly return home across the Channel. From Churchill's point of view, since Germany was having success with their elite units known as stormtroopers or shock troopers, who were capable of blitzkrieg tactics, he would one-up the Nazis with his commandos. In order to liberate Europe, he believed, striking companies, able to engage in both covert and overt actions, would have to be formed at once. Writing to his Chief of Staff, Lord Ismay, on June 6, 1940, Churchill demanded an elite new group of what he deemed the hunter class, who would terrorize the various Nazi fortifications erected along the coast of Europe and North Africa. Refusing to mince words, he wanted these commandos to excel in the art of butcher and bolt. Churchill's men would be trained in demolition, destruction, and assassination. They would be, in essence, self-contained killing machines. He envisioned the commandos as a steel hand from the sea. There is some debate as to when and where the term commando was first used. It may have been adopted during the French and Indian War, when General John Forbes wrote to Colonel Henry Bouquet during the campaign against Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh, in 1758. Others attribute the origin to Lieutenant Colonel D.W. Clark of the British Army, an early 20th century expert on the history of mobile raiding units used in various guerrilla wars then raging from the Middle East to South Africa and the Philippines. As it turns out, Clark knew firsthand the absolute success of Dutch commandos used during the Boer War in South Africa, 1899 to 1902. These Boer settlers instituted merciless scorched earth tactics against their foes. Churchill knew this very well since he had served as a war correspondent for London's Morning Post in South Africa, where he was even taken prisoner. In selecting the name Commando, Clark must have been aware that Winston Churchill had gained national fame as an escaped prisoner during the Boer War, Robert W. Black surmised in his book Rangers in World War II. The name Commando was certain to touch memories of youth and glory in the Prime Minister. Back in the United States, General Dwight Eisenhower, Assistant Chief of the Army War Plans Division, was encouraged by Britain's sped-up efforts to train self-contained fighting units who knew no fear. But as a staunch believer in traditional warfare, Eisenhower was more concerned about building up large infantry divisions brimming with modern tanks and M3 half-tracks that could overwhelm the Third Reich. Nonetheless, Eisenhower was also an open-minded pragmatist. Within the U.S. Army, a brilliant colonel from Texas, Lucien K. Truscott, was pushing General George Marshall to start up his own commando training program. On June 1, 1942, Marshall ordered the creation of an American commando unit. To regular Army traditionalists like Eisenhower and Marshall, adopting such SWAT team approaches to warfare could possibly prove perilous to troop morale. The mere fact that special forces, made up of volunteers, were suddenly needed inferred that the regular ones were not up to the job. In addition, selecting the creme de la creme out of each company would drain existing divisions of their best leaders. Truscott, however, eventually got the go-ahead. He went to Northern Ireland to study British commando training and report back what he learned. His transatlantic mission was attached with a lukewarm endorsement from Eisenhower. "If you do find it necessary to organize such units," Eisenhower instructed Truscott, "I hope you will find some other name than Commando, for the glamour of that name will always remain, and properly so, British." No country, it seems, enjoys macho male fighters and iconoclastic daredevils quite as vociferously as the United States, the land of John Wayne and Rambo. After all, its capital city was named after George Washington, the world-renowned guerrilla fighter of the Revolutionary War. The father of the Navy, John Paul Jones, continues to live on in the national folklore as the gutsy captain who uttered, "I have not yet begun to fight." Hardscrabble backwoodsmen like Davy Crockett and Andrew Jackson became the post-Revolutionary War generation's first heroes. Given this penchant for frontier cunning and true grit, it's not surprising that the American public excitedly embraced the whole concept of British commandos liberating Europe from Nazi totalitarianism. As historian Joanna MacDonald noted in her book, The Liberation of Pointe Du Hoc, even the New York Times enthused that the commandos were super guerrillas, the modern Apaches of the British armies. An article in the venerable Harper's Weekly by Bruce Thomas, which MacDonald also references, took the commando enthusiasm a step further, reaching true comic book-like characterizations in his lengthy article. According to Thomas, the British commando was a combination of Peck's bad boy, Robin Hood, Tarzan, Superman, Daniel Boone, and a Boy Scout. He is the cagiest and canniest fighting man on the loose today, Thomas wrote, as if coming straight from the pages of a 1840s Crockett Almanac. His average age is 27. They are the world's #1 guerrilla fighters in unconventional scouts. It was left to Colonel Truscott to come up with an appropriate name for a new American commando outfit. Luckily for him, an obvious candidate was already in the air. Novelist Kenneth Roberts had recently published Northwest Passage about the exploits of Rangers during the French and Indian War. A movie version starring Spencer Tracy and Walter Brennan was released in 1940, garnering strong box office receipts. The popularity of Roberts's Indian Fighter novel movie, plus the fact that Truscott was a Texan well steeped in the Lone Star lore of Austin and Hayes, naturally led to Ranger surfacing to the top of his name list. In straightforward fashion, Truscott recalls his decision in his 1954 memoir, Command Missions, a personal story. Many names were recommended, he wrote. I selected Rangers because few words have a more glamorous connotation in American military history. In colonial days, men so designated had mastered the art of Indian warfare and were guardians of the frontier. Having a moniker and a mission, however, was the easy preliminary step in creating a Special Forces outfit. The key to building a first-rate military is always based on first-rate training. Finding the right leader for the 1st Ranger Battalion would be of the foremost importance. The United States and the world is lucky that Major William O. Darby of Fort Smith, Arkansas, West Point class of '33, was available for the task. Honest and tough as nails, Darby, like a Lombardi-style football coach, knew how to train young men. As a field artillery officer serving as an aide to the U.S. Army in Northern Ireland, he inspired loyalty, respect, and, at appropriate times, fear in his eager recruits. His greatest gift was in knocking the hot dog factor out of young men overly impressed with their athletic prowess or all-night stamina. With America now at war against Germany, Italy, and Japan, Darby was looking for approximately 35 officers and 450 men who were highly intelligent, morally fit, physically healthy, and psychologically sound. Darby, in sum, was looking for the best of the best. Whiners or wimps of any kind need not apply. He found the soldiers he was looking for. They came from every state in the Union. They were all volunteers. They all wanted to destroy Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo. More than 2,000 men applied for the honor of becoming a Ranger. The 700 who survived the first round of cuts came seemingly straight out of a populist Carl Sandburg poem. As Joanna McDonald points out, the youngest was Private Lemuel Harris, only 18, from Pocahontas, Virginia. The oldest was 35-year-old Sergeant J.B. Cummer of Amarillo, Texas. Many of these applicants' occupations spoke directly of the regions they hailed from: bullfighter, cowboy, oysterman, burlesque operator, church deacon, oil speculator, railroad worker, coal miner, tomato farmer, barber, insurance salesman. Just reading the roll call of names conjured up an image akin to a massive Benton mural. Before long, after a few weeks of tough training, 180 men were dropped from the competitive program. They were good men, made of the finest American fiber, but not quite good enough to become Rangers. The outfit that can slip up on the enemy and stun him with shock and surprise, Darby declared, is the outfit that will win battles, and that is the outfit I want. On June 20th, the remaining 520 were shipped off to the British Commando Training Depot in Scotland, isolated among seals and otters far north in the lush rolling hills of the windswept highlands along the River Ness. The U.S. Army advance scouts have reported back to Truscott that a key element of the commando swagger was that they believed they were the finest fighting men anywhere. Pessimism, for the most part, was not in their makeup. Optimism and patriotic platitudes like saving the world for democracy and freedom from fear coursed through their veins. Their esprit de corps must be kept at its peak by frequent allusions to their superiority to troops trained in ordinary ways, Lieutenant Alfred H. Nelson wrote to Truscott. He added a competitive, jingoistic aside. We do believe that it is possible, by use of some of the British methods, plus some that I am sure will be devised by our own commanders, to train American personnel to do a better job in any situation than that done by their British forerunners. Over the decades, Hollywood has made numerous films showing just how hard the U.S. Army trains its elite troops. But the most accurate description available of what it was like to be a recruit in the 1st Ranger Battalion won't be found in an Oliver Stone or Taylor Hackford movie. It can, however, be gleaned from William Darby's 1980 memoir, which is appropriately titled Darby's Rangers, We Led the Way, written with the assistance of William H. Balmer. Darby reports in that book, "We marched swiftly, swam rivers, or crossed them on bridges made of toggle ropes. There were cliffs to climb, slides to tumble down. When all that was quite enough, we played hard games." Oral histories of the 1st Ranger Battalion veterans who served in Great Britain tell of log roll competitions, boxing matches, speed marches, jiu-jitsu bouts, bayonet drills, swamp treks, starvation tactics, mock battles, and push-up marathons. Salutes were judged on technique, and uniforms were somehow supposed to be clean after drilling in a bog. When the whistle blew, you responded as if your life depended on it. This was basically think fast or die training. The paradoxical trick was to follow both orders and to think for oneself. According to Ronald L. Lane and Rutter's Rangers, this first wave of Rangers had a scrap notions of sportsmanship, to learn that war was a dirty business without set rules. They had to become, in effect, versatile in the art of killing. And then there was the weapons training. They were instructed to use the M1 carbine, the M1 Garand rifle, Thompson submachine gun, Browning automatic rifle, and a 60mm M2 mortar. 5 different grenades were passed out, ranging from the basic offensive hand grenade to a thermite grenade, and one that merely illuminated the sky. Because friendly fire and accidents claimed so many lives in combat, the Rangers were taught how not to make mistakes with weaponry that was meant solely for the enemy. What is most relevant to this study, however, is the way this first class of U.S. Army Rangers was trained to climb towering cliffs by using spikes and rope ladders. Various 14 to 20-foot walls were constructed in open fields. The Rangers were taught to scramble up them quickly, then once on top, leap down in the mud, roll over, and with an automatic weapon in hand, start blasting away at various movable targets. Sprinting up small mountainsides while mortar shells exploded all around them was another part of their grueling training. Even for unflappable young men, trudging up a hill weighed down with equipment with explosions going off all around you was unnerving. Eager youths were being molded into hard-shell men. Those Rangers who graduated from the Scottish School on August 1st, 1942, were soon relocated to Argyll for a month of rigorous amphibious training with the British Royal Navy. Lord Louis Mountbatten, who had been appointed head of combined operations by Churchill, instructed Truscott to select around 50 of his best Rangers to help Canada and Britain in an upcoming top-secret raid against the so-called Atlantic Wall, which the Nazis had fortified along the entire coastline of France. As it turned out, the first Americans to die in a World War II battle in Europe, in fact, would be members of the 1st Ranger Battalion when they raided the Normandy town of Dieppe. The high-risk assault on the German-occupied port of Dieppe began early on August 19th. An armada carrying almost 250 Allied vessels left England, hauling more than 6,000 troops and 60 tanks. The Allied forces immediately took heavy casualties. With Allied air squadrons bombing Nazi fortifications along the Atlantic coast, the brave Canadian commandos, along with their American and British counterparts, tried to scale 30 to 100-foot tall cliffs, overtake the enemy, and then march into the French resort. But from the start, nothing worked out as planned. Some commandos and Rangers, however, actually made it over the imposing cliffs. One Ranger, Corporal Franklin Coons, in fact, successfully killed the first Nazi he laid eyes on. The Americans had arrived. And there was other good news. For the most part, the big German guns guarding the Norman town were annihilated. Seeing their smoldering rubble was a good omen for the Allies' future. But the immediate military reality was inescapable. British, Canadians, and Americans were driven back into the sea. By any traditional standard, the cross-channel raid was an unmitigated disaster. It is a small wonder that the very word Dieppe, historians William Whitehead and Terence McCartney Philgate wrote, chills the hearts of an entire generation. Of the 6,100 British and Canadian troops who took part, over 3,500 were either killed, captured, or deemed missing in action. Some men drowned trying to get to the beach, while others fell to their death attempting to climb the uncooperative cliffs. Not a single tank managed to get into the town. A staggering 160 Allied planes were shot down, while the German Luftwaffe lost only 48. Stung by the setback, a weary Churchill was, for intelligence-gathering reasons, sickened to learn that the Nazis had captured over 1,000 of his men. As for the 50 specially chosen Rangers, 6 were killed, while another 7 were wounded in action, and 4 captured by the enemy. In the wake of Dieppe, the 1st Ranger Battalion was ordered to move to the town of Dundee for an intensified program in coastal raiding. As one historian wrote in a book called Darby's Rangers, the Rangers practiced attacking pillboxes, gun batteries, and other coastal defenses. In Dundee, the Rangers stayed with families in town, as there were no barracks available to them. While Dieppe was only a raid, Hitler's propaganda chief, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, immediately marketed it for global consumption as a full-fledged invasion. Berlin newspaper headlines, under Goebbels' orders, reveled in the result. Catastrophic defeat, a setback to the invasion, one headline read. Another, what does Stalin say about this disaster to Churchill's invasion? If one wanted to render a tough historical verdict, it was as if Churchill had another Gallipoli-like debacle on his hands. You've got to start one day fighting the enemy, Lord Lovat of No. 4 Commando Company had warned Churchill, but you don't start by landing frontally in daylight at a defended port like Dieppe. With the benefit of hindsight, however, Dieppe looks a little less like an utter Allied failure than it seemed at the time. Churchill himself thought the raid was mostly successful. Dieppe occupied a place of its own in the story of the war, and the grim casualty figures must not class it as a failure, he wrote. It was a costly but not unfruitful reconnaissance in force. Without question, the amount of Allied casualties occurred vis-a-vis the Nazis was unacceptable. But this D-Day dress rehearsal had positive side effects. From Dieppe onward, U.S., British, and Canadian troops would work in closer unison. For example, the 1st Ranger Battalion cooperated more closely with a group of No. 1 and 6 commandos known as Camerades. Both commandos and Rangers would intensify their efforts to practice amphibious landings, cliff climbing, destroying pillboxes, and liberating coastal towns. Meanwhile, the American media, gleeful that the Rangers had participated in the large-scale raid, bannered its own more upbeat headlines, one reading, U.S. and Britain invade France. Darby's Rangers, like Rogers' Rangers of old, were taking on a mythic stature. By October, they were given Operation Torch, the name for the invasion of North Africa, assignments to take out a 2-gun battery perch on a jutting cliff in the harbor of Arzew, Algeria, which lorded over the primary landing beaches. On the evening of November 8th, they succeeded. For the next couple of months, as they were assigned to the Arming Training Center at Arzew, the Rangers stayed in Algeria or next door Tunisia. Now that the Rangers owned Arzew, they were responsible for guarding the hospitals, ammo depots, and town center. After that, they secured Gafsa and El Ghoutar and kept on going. If the North African campaign was successful, sacking Sicily next would be a distinct possibility. Then, in late January 1943, they were truly unleashed. By February 11th, they had successfully devastated Italian forces guarding Sened Pass. Sened Station was a German supply station for ammunitions and was kept heavily guarded, Ranger Bing Evans recalled. They also had troops in there ready to move up to the front. Whether it was bridge demolition or river forging or slitting throats of an Italian in broad daylight, the 1st Rangers were, without question, the gutsiest new Army outfit around. They became pros at disembarking, largely undetected, from landing craft to conduct speed raids. It's a prickly feeling you get on an invasion, Ranger Thomas Sullivan wrote his brother in August 1943. We could see the big searchlights on shore, and the sea was so rough I got very seasick. First time. We came in small assault boats. I was very tense and kept gripping my rifle. As we were about to land, I was raring to go. About that time, a wave dusted over me and cooled me off. We jumped into the water and ran ashore. Firing started, and from there it was c'est la guerre. As Darby recalled in his memoirs, the Rangers of early 1943 had become a miniature Stonewall Jackson force, operating like the Confederate foot cavalry in the Shenandoah Valley during our Civil War. Historian Ronald Lane put it more succinctly: the first Rangers in North Africa literally slaughtered the enemy. Perhaps the highest compliment in warfare occurs when your dire enemy nicknames you out of begrudging admiration. One doesn't need to know all the daily maneuvers of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in North Africa to comprehend that his moniker, the Desert Fox, is a tribute to his cunning. So when the 1st Ranger Battalion annihilated the elite Italian units at Sened Station, with Darby winning the Silver Star for valor, an ominous nickname emerged for the outfit. The Italians now called the U.S. Army Rangers Black Death. They were spearheaded with the task of invading Sicily and Italy, and praise came pouring in from Washington and London. While reconvening at Gafsa, a proud Darby corralled all of his men together for an impromptu talk. Eisenhower, impressed by the successes of the 1st Battalion, had claimed he was now a convert, completely sold on the Rangers. Darby's Rangers would land on the left flank at Salerno in September 1943. Still later, they dramatically seized the town of Maiori and the imposing heights of the Chiunzi Pass overlooking Naples, and denied the pass to the Germans to counterattack the Allied beaches. They also looked down on the Germans in Naples and kept them under fire. And the commendations spread like wildfire throughout the ranks of the U.S. Army and beyond. By March 1943, with combat experience under their belts, a specially selected group of Rangers was sent back to the United States to help train the 2nd Ranger Battalion, which was being organized in a bustling Tennessee outpost called Camp Forrest. Chapter 2. Rudder's Rangers. It was April Fool's Day 1943 when the United States activated the 2nd Ranger Battalion. However, this time around, training in Northern Ireland or Scotland was not part of the plan. Camp Forrest, one of the Army's busiest posts during World War II, located near Tullahoma, Tennessee, would be their initial training ground. Named after the brash Confederate cavalry general Nathan Bedford Forrest, the remote camp was designed to train infantry, artillery, engineer, and signal units. It was an 85,000-acre site erected 1,070 feet above sea level, the highest point between Nashville and Chattanooga. This vital facility became a frenetic beehive of military activity during the war years. Major General George Patton, for example, brought his 2nd Armored Hell on Wheels Division up from Fort Benning, Georgia, to participate in maneuvers. A little concrete was spilled and guard towers erected to give the Tennessee mudflat the illusion of permanence. Military personnel flooded the boomtown area. As Tullahoma grew, a so-called tent city was erected for the Rangers, since lodging quarters came at a premium. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the population of Tullahoma was 4,500. By the time the atomic bomb was detonated on Hiroshima, it had grown to 75,000. A few of the new arrivals were 1st Ranger Battalion fighters who came to Tullahoma ready to share eye-opening stories about the North Africa campaign and to instill in the newly formed 2nd Battalion the fighting spirit of the 1st. But for them to succeed, it was imperative that the Army find the right commanding officer. A revolving door of potential candidates came and went, some lasting only a couple of days. It was tricky finding the right man, with the right temperament, to lead such an elite, new fighting unit. Comprised of 27 officers and 404 enlisted men, the 2nd Battalion would have a company headquarters and 6 Ranger infantry companies. Every hour, it seemed, some high-ranking desk officer was reconfiguring the Rangers. They were a work in progress. A majority of the volunteers came from New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. But Texas provided the hardscrabble man eventually tapped to be the commanding officer. In late June, Major James E. Rudder was assigned command of the battalion. As historian Gordon L. Routman explained, with the arrival of Rudder, things began to tighten up. Known by his friends as Big Jim, the stocky, tough-talking, no-nonsense Rudder was born on May 6, 1910, in the West Texas town of Eden. He was one of 6 children whose father ran a livestock business near the Concho River. When he was 17, he was recruited to play football at Tarleton, a junior college in nearby Stephenville. He was a center. Determined to be an Aggie, Rudder, who dug ditches to help his family survive the Great Depression, transferred to Texas A&M in 1930. 2 years later, when the 6-foot, 220-pound Rudder graduated, he had been commissioned as a second lieutenant of infantry in the Army Reserve. Blessed with the chiseled Hollywood good looks of Glenn Ford, accentuated with the touch of Gene Hackman gruffness, Rudder was unabashed in his zeal for hard tackling, take no prisoners, Texas-style football. In college, it was said, he loved to block more than breathe, and he was a gridiron leader. For a few years before the war, he coached the Brady and Tarleton High School teams to winning records. Rudder was called to active duty following Pearl Harbor. In rapid succession, he attended infantry school at Fort Benning, served as battalion executive officer at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and went to the Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. After bouncing around to various stateside posts, he was dispatched to Texas to make men out of boys. All of the 18 or 19-year-old volunteers who made up most of the 2nd Ranger Battalion recalled the day Rudder arrived at Camp Forest. He told his Rangers, "I'm going to work you harder than you've ever worked. In a shorter time than you can imagine, you're going to be the best fighting unit in this man's army." Drills became tougher. Double time became the mantra. 12-mile hikes turned to 24-mile endurance treks. Catching one's breath was a dilly-dally, guaranteed to cost you 50 additional push-ups on the spot. Obstacle courses sprung up at unexpected places like unwelcome mushrooms in a field of green. If you had been bench pressing 100 pounds, you were told to up the weight to 150 or 200 pounds. Boxing matches, with or without gloves, were encouraged. But Rudder cared deeply about each of his men. He talked to you softly but firmly like a big brother, one of his star Rangers, Leonard Lamel, recalled. He inspired you to do your best. You just wanted to die for him. Yet in a number of important ways, basic creature comforts improved. There was an egalitarian fairness about the way Rudder treated enlisted men that commanded almost instant loyalty. He resourcefully wrangled wooden barracks for his men, getting them out of the tent city. Instead of the daily Army sea rations of corned beef, hash, boiled carrots, canned peaches, and stale bread, soon-to-be Rangers were trained to be cooks. Indoor latrines were open. Mosquito netting was provided in the barracks. And most important, this dizzying 6 weeks of brutal training, the kind that would tax any man both mentally and physically, suddenly seemed to have a galvanizing purpose. Forget Darby's Rangers. They were Rudder's Rangers, and they were going to be the best. These men President Reagan would dub the Boys of Pointe Du Hoc in 1984 started gelling as a first-rate battalion in the sticky summer days of Tullahoma, Tennessee. To get into the Rangers, you had to volunteer, Ranger Ralph Gornison recalled. And any time during training, you could volunteer out because of the physical requirements, mental requirements, or just the fact that you just plain didn't fit. We had a high turnover at the beginning. If Rudder had a particular genius, it was in eyeing talent. He was not impressed by mere brawn. A Ranger, he believed, had to have moxie and heart. Take, for example, the story of 22-year-old Private William Petty of Georgia. A bright, pale-skinned former scholarship student at the University of Georgia, he had arrived at Camp Forest as a private in the 30th Division of the Tennessee National Guard. Unfortunately, when parachuting out of a helicopter one afternoon, he had broken both legs. Everybody noticed Private Petty had a terrible limp. He waddled when walking, resembling Charlie Chaplin in The Tramp. When he took the physical to become a Ranger, the doctor nixed his candidacy. "Sorry, son, you don't qualify. "Next man," the physician barked. Reuter agreed with the rendering. Petty, however, refused to accept the exclusionary medical verdict. He started arguing, demanding either a more Mayo Clinic-like medical exam or a simple second chance. "You've got false teeth," doctor said. "You can't be a ranger with false teeth. There's no way you can get in the Rangers without your choppers, son." Petty, whose teeth had been knocked out playing football, went to see Reuter. The very fact that even after fracturing both legs he still wanted to be a Ranger showed true heart. Petty insisted to Reuter that it was unfair to disqualify him because of his dental malady. He ended his plea with a dramatic, "Hell, sir, I don't want to eat 'em, I want to fight 'em." A smiling Reuter signed a form and handed it to Petty. "Here, take this back down there to the medics, you're in." Petty was assigned to F Company and would win the Silver Star at Pointe Du Hoc for killing over 30 Nazi soldiers. Although many men passed the physical, the unbearable Tennessee humidity caused many of them to throw in the towel. Dehydration was rampant. The sultry heat enveloped the would-be Rangers with brutal, unrelenting consistency. Uniforms would be drenched with sweat after only 5 or 10 minutes of drilling in combat gear. Exhaustion was the normal state of being. Rest, it turned out, was a word for the civilian effete. Staten Islander Herman Stein, a member of F Company, years later told of how his buddies were dropping like flies due to heat exhaustion. To survive the regimen, he broke the rule of 1 canteen of water per long march. On one extended break, we stopped by a swampy section, filled up our canteens, added a couple of iodine pills, and presto, instant revitalization, Stein recalled. This was the civilian soldier's way of thinking. You take orders to a degree, but when it interferes with your rationalization and you start performing like a zombie, then it's time to do something about it. Many times under fire, we made up our own minds what to do. On August 1st, just as the 2nd Ranger Battalion began to grow accustomed to Camp Forest, they were transferred to subtropical Fort Pierce, Florida. Located just north of Palm Beach on the Atlantic Ocean, it was the home of the U.S. Navy Scouts and Raiders School. The muggy Tennessee woods, after all, were not the place to plan an amphibious Dieppe-like raid. True, you could build up endurance by jogging down rutted pine forest roads in extreme heat, or by scaling sheer mountainsides in a thunderstorm, but Camp Forest lacked sufficient water for amphibious training. These Rangers were being groomed to eventually cross the English Channel in a daring invasion plan known as Operation Overlord. They needed to acquire sea legs. They needed to learn how to navigate rubber boats, patch them up, and inflate them while under fire. They needed to learn how to avoid the hideous pitfalls of seasickness, undertows, and rising tides. Shortly after arriving at Fort Pierce by train, the Rangers made the acquaintance of so-called Navy frogmen, the underwater demolition experts, who would be renamed SEALs nearly 20 years later when John F. Kennedy was president. These aquatic frogmen had found this palm tree-lined town, located along the Indian River, perfect for dives. One part of Fort Pierce, in fact, was already known as Dynamite Point because of its frequent use by the Navy underwater demolition teams. The Rangers, after learning amphibious warfare tactics from the frogmen, were immediately put into an intense 11-day class. Among their teachers were scarred 1st Ranger Battalion survivors of the bold invasion of Algeria and Tunisia. All of their training was leading to a final, all-out graduation drill, the mock attack and capture of humble Fort Pierce. The Rangers held to a round-the-clock schedule, Ronald L. Lane wrote in Rutter's Rangers. It seemed to boost morale. They practiced landing on rock jetties, loading and unloading in the landing craft assaults, known as LCAs, from landing nets, and studying silhouettes on shore from positions at sea. They made company and battalion cross-country marches, which included portaging their rubber boats, making beachheads, infiltrating through beach sentries, and attacking small installations. They learned how to send small beach marking parties ashore from boats at sea. Anybody who underestimates mock battles, thinking there's something akin to recreational paintball matches held by weekend warriors all across America, is dead wrong. At Fort Pierce, chronic seasickness, sandfly bites, sprained ankles, and heat exhaustion were all part of the fare. Most discouraging of all is what happened when they tried to cool off in the ocean water. Schools of jellyfish attacked them. Moans could be heard from several tents where a ranger's flesh had been stung by the touch of these creatures, Lane recalled. Even calamine lotion did little to help to relieve the sting. The rangers interviewed in recent years, however, seldom mentioned the deprivations of Fort Pierce. What they're most proud of is that they successfully captured the town with only a few broken ribs as misfortunes. The end result of the 2nd Battalion's enduring Florida in capturing Fort Pierce was that they had passed their amphibious training. They were truly cohering as a unit. On September 17th, the 2nd Ranger Battalion were once again relocated, this time to Fort Dix, New Jersey. Since most of the men were from the East Coast, this would provide them with an opportunity to reconnect with their families, or so they thought. In truth, the rigors of Fort Dix were daunting. This was their last stop before being shipped off to Great Britain, and Rudder wanted to make sure his Rangers were in tip-top shape. Everything from calisthenics to sprint marches and range firing intensified. At night, they rubbed black grease on their faces and practiced covert moonlight actions, presumably unnoticed by the locals. One survival drill had the men dropped off in an isolated New Jersey pine barren for a few days. They had to live off the land, shooting rabbits or stealing chickens to stay alive. A particular focus was given to scaling 50 to 60-foot tall towers. For a few days, the men were sent to Maryland for intelligence briefings. Together, they had already made the history books. They established a U.S. Army record, 15 miles in a 2-hour speed march. And then they had their last hurdle, complete physical. Decades after D-Day, the surviving members of Rudder's Rangers had fond memories of Fort Dix. It was during this period that the enlisted men were promoted from private to private first class. Because they worked so hard during the day, Rudder gave his men night passes. They frequented such bars as the Shamrock Inn and Herbie's Derby. Over pitchers of cheap beer, they sang Bing Crosby and George M. Cohen songs. Those more adventurous hopped the Greyhound bus for the 74-mile trip to New York's Times Square, Greenwich Village, and Rockefeller Center. The 2nd Ranger Battalion's last week stateside involved an accelerated course in what constituted the Third Reich. Most of the men were forced to learn basic German. All of them were instructed on how to use captured Nazi weaponry. In intelligence briefings, they learned about the Gestapo, the French resistance, and Mein Kampf. It all fell under the essential wisdom, know thy enemy. Just before Thanksgiving, the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion boarded the Queen Elizabeth, headed for the port city of Greenock, Scotland. The stately passenger liner, the largest steamship in the world, was the ideal troop transport because of its unsurpassed capacity and its unmatched speed. Before leaving, the soldiers were all issued an official blue and gold Ranger patch. They had passed the 6-week endurance course. To them, it meant more than a diploma, license, or certificate. It represented their honor, and it was worth dying for. Regular soldiers, however, called the patch a blue Sunoco because it closely resembled the logo of the Sunoco Oil Company. Jealous barbs aside, these Rangers were now more than a band of brothers of nearly 500 strong. They were an elite fraternity of lethal killers. While crossing the Atlantic, the Rangers served as military police, interacting with the few civilian passengers who for one reason or another were headed to Europe. The true purpose of their voyage was never revealed. Well rested and battle-ready, they arrived in Scotland on December 2, 1943, and were quickly transported south. 500 Rangers were greeted with 500 pairs of boxing gloves and a few miles of rope for our training on the cliffs of Cornwall, Owen Brown recalled. We climbed the cliffs along the Cornish coast and hiked the hills inland just for conditioning. The home base of Rudder's Rangers was the town of Bude, England, located on the Atlantic coast of Cornwall. As champagne was uncorked on New Year's Eve, speculation was rampant among the Rangers. Another group of specially trained U.S. Rangers, the 5th Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Max F. Schneider, would soon also arrive in Great Britain to train alongside the 2nd. Ever since mid-1942, Allied planning for an amphibious invasion of France had been in the works. But when? How many men would be needed? None of the Rangers knew. While the rumor mill ginned up various scenarios, the launch date remained top secret. The standard answer officers gave to the question when, however, was some variation of sooner rather than later. What the Rangers did know was that they would, in all likelihood, have to make a cross-channel invasion sometime in 1944 or 1945. Meanwhile, Rudder's Rangers spent January and February 1944 scaling Cornish cliffs, firing at movable targets with automatic weapons, and kindly ingratiating themselves with the citizens of Bude. Instead of living in barracks, in fact, the Rangers were assigned housing with locals. Some of the Rangers forged lifetime friendships with their host families. As 2nd Battalion Ranger Salva Mamone recalled, there were a pair of buddies in living quarters in private homes, and we paid the people we lived with so much a week, and we would get per diem every month to pay our expenses. When we traveled to a place to meet, we'd go in twos. We had a mess hall down in Bude, where we had our headquarters, and we all gathered, and had our lunch, breakfast, and dinner there. Then we'd go back to our private homes and do what we needed to do while we weren't training. The oddest part of the Rangers' training, a reoccurring drill that often unnerved them, was when they were suddenly ordered to be in some far-flung British town at a designated hour. Promptness was mandatory. How were they to get to a Scottish hamlet or London suburb, each at least a day's drive away, was up to them. It would take initiative. That was the quality Rudder most admired. Initiative. They would sneak on a train or bum a car ride or borrow a bicycle. It didn't matter. Getting to the designated destination at the desired time did. The objective, in retrospect, was obvious. These men, Rudder's Rangers, would soon have to learn to get around occupied France with a compass once they climbed the cliffs of Normandy and were in German-occupied hostile territory. Initiative, what the dictionary defines as the determination or ability to begin or to follow through energetically with a plan or task or enterprise, was the quality that would make the difference between life or death, freedom or fascism.